Welcome back to the People's Mirror. Now, MPs that sit in the Public Debt and Privatization Committee and also MPs that sit in the National Planning and Finance Committee are now to cut short their recess and December and January holidays and resume deliberations in Parliament ahead of the sale of the 15% stake in Safaricom that sources now reveal the executive want concluded before the first quarter of this year 2026 comes to an end. So we want to detail for you this entire story of these two funds, the infrastructure fund that is called the National Infrastructure Fund, and of course the Sovereign Wealth Fund that President Ruto has been talking about as the two funds that will now steer development in private and public sector arrangements in Kenya moving forward without depleting the resources of the Kenyan government and also without increasing the tax ceiling of the Kenyan government. So let's start from the very beginning with this issue. Sometimes back there was a talk that the government intended to sell their 15% stake in Safaricom. Currently, the government holds around 35% stake of Safaricom. So selling 15% stake in that particular suggestion that was being made by the National Treasury Cabinet Secretary, Honorable C.S. Mbadi, was to the effect that if this sale was effected, then around 6 billion shares of the government would be sold as a result of that particular transaction. Now, this particular talk came towards the end of the last year and the sale has since not happened. Now, today morning, sources reveal and different newspaper even reported to the effect of the same that now the members of parliament that sit in these two committees that I highlighted in the beginning of this episode, that is the Public Debt and Privatization Committee as long as the Public Planning and Finance Committee, are called upon by the Speaker Wetangula to cut short their recess in their holidays to come back to deliberations. Of course, when members of parliament are sitting outside the calendar days of the house, then the permission must come from the Speaker of the National Assembly for them to sit and deliberate. Now, Wetangula also spoke to this effect in his New Year message, which we detailed in an episode here at the People's Mirror sometimes back, when he was saying that one of the things that is going to happen in the year 2026 is a robust legislative framework, and of course looking into these two funds that are now being managed as part of a public limited company within the National Treasury. So let us detail the whole story for you. But if this is your first time with our channel, the People's Mirror, please hit the subscribe button so that you can find these stories and more like this over here. So this move is seen to underline the decision that will conclude the 244.5 billion. I will explain to you in depth later on in this episode how this amount comes to 244.5 billion, because if you calculate 60 billion shares at the rate of 34 Kenyan shillings that they are being sold, then the value comes at around 204 billion. So the question is, where does the additional 40 billion coming from? Now, another very interesting fact about this sale of the 15% stake of the shares that the government is holding in Safaricom is the fact that if they are sold, then the government will be in additional debt of 15.5 billion that no one is talking about, and here the People's Mirror we will detail how that debt comes to play. Kimani Ichung'wah has said that the previous government sold the 65% stake that the government had without anything being seen to that effect, and so now that they're just selling 15% to actually steer development under President Ruto's regime is when the issues are coming up. That too we will detail towards the end of this episode. So sources now reveal that the rush to have these members of parliament coming back for deliberation is as a result of the request of the executive, and the reason for this is that the executive wants to sell this 15% stake in this particular telecommunication company before the first quarter of 2026 comes to an end. Before we even go deeper, the reason for this, of course, is very evident. If the government wants this sale effected as quick as the first quarter of course the year 2026, and the funds that will be generated from this particular sale will be channeled towards the National Infrastructure Fund and of course towards the Sovereign Wealth Fund that President Ruto has been saying are the funds that he's using to steer development, then it's clear that the government wants this sale effected quickly so that the projects that are underlying right now be concluded by 2027 to give President William Ruto a good bargaining power in the ballot and of course within the campaigns that will exist in the few months ahead of those major elections, as someone that has concluded all the projects that he intended to conclude within his first term. So while other committees have been suspended until later in the month to carry out their mandate. Wetangula, the Speaker of the National Assembly, has now given permission to the Committees on Finance and National Planning and the Committee on Public Debt and Privatization. Of course, we say that it's straight law that if there is any sitting outside the calendar of the House, then the permission has to come from the Speaker of the National Assembly. So as a result of that, these two committees are being given mandate to come back and start deliberation ahead of this 15% stake sale that is supposed to happen. They say that this earlier deliberation will give them opportune time to carry out public participation and hear, of course, the thoughts of the stakeholders that are going to be affected by this 15% share sale. Of course, MPs must okay all these processes of selling public assets, but then the process of privatization often begins within the Ministry of Treasury, and that is there, of course, an entire obligation of the Minister of Finance. So these guys are coming to meet, deliberate on the tax returns that are going to come out as a result of this sale, deliberate on its effect, go looking for public participation on whether or not this particular sale needs to be effected. And of course, that particular public participation might not be done on the general public area. It will be done on the stakeholders in the regions that will be directly affected within the operations of the government if the 15% stake, that is the shares of around 6 billion government shares in Safaricom, could be sold to an external party. Now, the minister is the one that identifies and determines which particular entity to sell. This is actually a very good autonomy that is only a reserve of the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury, that sits down and decide which entity could actually be sold at what percentage to generate these particular resources to steer towards development for the country. The question on its constitutionalism will be detailed later on in the middle of this episode, but as it stands right now, when the government wants to privatize any part of its particular entities as per the privatization law that exists in the country right now, then that mandate first starts from the Ministry of Treasury, where the minister determines and identifies which entities to be sold and then shares that particular proposal with the cabinet that scrutinizes whether or not it is fit and then approves or fails to approve. So last month, the government suggested the sale of this 15% stake that we are talking about. What are we talking about? Currently, the government of Kenya has 35% interest in the company that is called Safaricom PLC. Now, Safaricom PLC is the largest private entity company, or private public company that Kenya has, that is listed in the Nairobi Stock Exchange right now. Its values, the value of its shares are very high. This 15% stake itself constitutes around 60 billion shares in that particular company. Now, there are talks here before we even go into this 15% sale. The side of the government is saying, for us to arrive at a particular point where the government just has 35% interest in this company that is called Safaricom, it means 65% has gone somewhere. And so from the position of Kimani Ichung'wah, it's very certain that this 65% sale occurred without involving the public in the previous regimes, and actually occurred without that money being channeled to any serious development that can be pointed to and can be seen. So he challenges anyone that challenged the 15% stake sale right now to first answer to Kenyans where the 65% that has gone away without any explanation and without any direct development being attributed to it went to. Now, away from that, President Ruto's government right now says that you do not need to borrow more loans to actually build infrastructure. Neither do you need to burden the taxpayer with more taxes to build infrastructure. So the result is creating this particular public limited company within the National Treasury that will oversee two funds called the National Infrastructure Fund and the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And these two funds come from a sales of course, or privatization of parastatals and government shares in private companies, or it can as well come from a public private partnership, triple P arrangements. So in this particular case, we are talking about this 15% shares that the government has in Safaricom being sold to a South Africa's company called Vodacom Group for a consideration of around 34 bob for each share. So if you calculate 34 shillings per each share for 6 billion, pardon me, I have used 60 consistently in this particular episode, pardon me, the exact figure is 6 billion. So if you use 34 shillings times the 6 billion that they are actually talking about, then you arrive at around 204 billion Kenyan shillings that the government is supposed to get from this particular sale. Now, interestingly, the 20% stake that the government is still having within Safaricom, also they want an upfront dividend payment of 40 billion. Now, this is very interesting. The government wants their upfront dividend from the value that they would have gotten from this particular remaining 20 this particular remaining 20% of shares within Safaricom. They want an upfront payment of 40 billion in dividends. Now, this particular 40 billion in dividends will be recouped back by the company being Vodacom at a cost of around 55.7 billion. So the amount that they want the government to the Vodafone company rather to pay them upfront is around 40.2 billion, and the amount that the government will pay back as a result of this particular upfront dividend once it recoups will be around 55.7 billion. Now, the difference between these two is around 15.5 billion. So this is why we are saying that the sale of these particular shares within Safaricom will first give government 204 billion upfront for selling the 6 billion shares at, of course, the consideration of 34 shillings. Then after that, government is asking for another 40 billion dividends upfront to have around 244.5 billion. It's 244.5, yes, around 244.5 billion, because they are asking for another 40.2 billion in this particular 20% dividends. And then they're saying that this 40.2 billion that they're being given upfront will be recouped back by the company being Vodacom Group from South Africa. And when they're recouping it back, the government will pay the 40 billion that they took as an upfront dividend at a rate of around 55.7 billion. Now, the difference will give you around 15.5 billion that the government will again pay to Vodafone as a result of effecting this sale. Now, this is the part they're not talking about much. People are just attacking this particular sale on the point of the 34 shillings being a lower consideration compared to the current rates of Safaricom's shares right now. But people are not seeing that the upfront request of a 40 billion additionally in dividends that will be recouped at an additional 15.5 billion means that we are actually selling the government shares to Vodafone and still getting into a debt of 15.5 billion to be paid from taxpayers' money. So it beats logic if this particular sale is supposed to go through, but President William Ruto has justified it that it is needed for the National Infrastructure Fund as well as for the Sovereign Wealth Fund, so that development can go without burdening the taxpayer, of course, with so much tax and of course without more borrowing. Though it seems that if the additional 40.2 billion is to be given to the government, then the taxpayer will still be burdened to the tune of 15.5 billion in debt. Now, Vodafone will buy these shares from Safaricom from the government on Safaricom. At the same time, Vodacom Group is also buying 5% stake from now the currently parent company, the original parent company that is called Vodafone PLC, that also has shares in this particular company called Safaricom. So at the end of this entire thing, the government will maintain around 20% shares of this particular company being Safaricom, which they will have received an upfront 40 billion payment in dividends. So the government will have its 20% shares and a debt of 15.5 billion to pay Vodafone after this particular transaction is effected. Then after that, Vodacom themselves, they will have 55%, because now their shares, if you tie the 15% that they'll be buying from the government of Kenya and the 5% that they will be buying from the British holding PLC, that is the Vodafone PLC, that is 20% that they will be buying as a result of this transaction, and you add that to the original 35% share that they have in Safaricom right now, because they had those equal shares with the government of Kenya. It will turn out that Vodacom now will have 55% of Safaricom, which is the biggest listed company in Nairobi Stock Exchange. Now, the effect of this has been discussed either way. Other groups feel like if Vodacom comes and takes overall control of Safaricom, then issues of impartiality can now be witnessed from this particular network that in the previous and in the recent past have been blamed to actually collude with the government agencies to give very key information during the time of crackdowns when the government is actually looking for certain individuals, like in the Mandamano time. Now, people have actually attacked Safaricom for actually breaching data privacy rules within the Kenyan government, but then you would not have expected Safaricom to sit at a very impartial place if all those shares, around 35% of them, came from the government. Now, at a time where Vodacom has a possibility of owning 55% of this particular company, those hopes now expand that within that particular range, perhaps then the control and overall control of this particular company will be impartial, and so such issues of data breach and data protection privacy violations will not be witnessed moving forward. But then on resource wise, the opposition have actually challenged this particular move by the government on the grounds that this is actually state wealth that needs to be managed sustainably for the future generation to also have a share in it. And as it stands right now, the government had lost around 65% of shares in this particular company. The little 35%, according to the United Opposition, ought not to have been sold, but ought to have been conserved, of course, as public wealth moving forward. But the government says that these shares are lying here without anything. First, 65% of them have been sold previously without anything being seen. Now, President William Ruto feels like the current economy needs development. According to the statements of the CS Treasury, Honorable Mbadi, they say that for the country to grow, actually, employments need to increase. And President William Ruto's promise for the year 2026 is that he intends to cut unemployment rate to half. And so for employment to actually exist, it means there has to be infrastructure, construction going on within the country. And for all this construction to go on, there has to be a base, a source of funds to actually channel the construction of roads, bridges, and things like that. And for that fund to be there, it either has to come from where we tax more from the citizens or from where we borrow. Now President Ruto says that he has unearthed a new method where you can actually sell government shares that are lagging without doing anything in places like Safaricom to channel them towards development. So that is where this particular hitch is at. But from the angle where we sit at the People's Mirror, two key things remain points to analyze. One is the issue of accountability, and two, the issue of constitutionalism. When it comes to accountability, we have seen structures being created under this regime, including the shift from NHIF to now Share and Shift. We have seen the e-citizen being created as a very good platform to minimize corruption from all public sector and from all regions of government operations where corruption was rampant. But at the end of it, these institutions turn out to actually be cash cows for bigger corruption cartels. And so the issue might be, this might be a perfect idea, a very perfect idea, to create two funds, the National Infrastructure Fund and the Sovereign Wealth Fund, where now development can channel from. But the question is, will the people who will be charged with the mandate to manage these funds be accountable enough that these funds end up in development, or is this just another way of creating avenues to siphon public resources from the public into public limited companies, and then they find their roots to people's pockets? And then other than accountability is, of course, the issue of constitutionalism. Everything else that is inconsistent with the constitution, of course, in practice in Kenya is null and void. And so if these funds do not find room within the constitution, where now we have the industrialization fund and funds like that, then what is the basis of these particular funds now? The MPs that are coming back from recess early to deliberate on these issues are expected to put this to rest through public participation, through their own expert involvement, and of course by the time that they're going to vote on this particular sale, we need to know whether the MPs have addressed these issues to the end, whether or not the issue of accountability will be resolved, and whether this particular move to have the sovereign fund, the Sovereign Welfare Fund and the National Infrastructure Fund will meet the constitutionalism test in front of the eyes of the members of Parliament. Now, those are some of the major issues that members of Parliament will be called upon to grapple with in the first few months of this new year. Now, President Ruto intends to use these two funds to attract private investment, reduce reliance on loans, as I said, and finance projects in transport and energy. When we talk about private investment, attract private investment, of course, when private investors see that if they invest in Kenya and their shares in the companies are doing well, then those shares can actually be used to steer development within the region. It's actually an attractive move to involve themselves in those particular business deals. But to reduce reliance on loans, this do not make sense, because an additional 15.5 billion will be in debt, which now has to either be accrued from loans or has to be accrued from the the pockets of the ordinary mwananchi. Ladies and gentlemen, what has happened so far? Cabinet now has approved these particular funds, being the National Infrastructure Fund and the Sovereign Wealth Fund, as limited liability companies but under the Treasury. So these funds are not being managed by the ordinary systems, or are not being managed by the National Treasury like the other funds that are created within the constitution, but rather they are being managed as a private limited company that is created by the Cabinet of Kenya, but that is being managed by the National Treasury. The opposition has now pledged to challenge this particular sale in court, citing lack of public participation and the threat on Kenyan wealth. Of course, Kalonzo was quoted saying that this particular move now is not sustainable to the future generation because it takes away the wealth that is key for the future generation away from them to solve infrastructural problems for now. It says that Safaricom is public wealth that ought to have been preserved not only for the generation that is enjoying it right now, but to the future generation within the same capacity to enjoy it as much as we have. So they are saying that they are going to challenge this particular decision to sell the 15% stake in court. We'll see how that goes. Remember, the United Opposition challenged the 280 billion that needed to come from the USA for health matters in the country. That particular deal that was signed by the US Secretary of State, and of course Honorable Mudavadi. So we are yet also to see what the court will say if the United Opposition proceeds on challenging the constitutionalism of these funds and of course of the sale of Safaricom. Now, President Ruto is keen on the outcome of the committee, as we said in the very beginning, because the outcome of the committee will justify whether or not President William Ruto will finish his projects before 2027 general election and give him enough room to use those particular projects to campaign as a success of his first term, calling for re-election in 2027 into the second term. Of course, this task is among major issues aimed at improving livelihoods and strengthening economies, as per Wetangula's New Year message. So he calls upon the members of parliament who are in those two committees, being the public finance committee, public planning rather and finance committee, and public debt and privatization committees, to actually resume, deliberate and start on public participation ahead of this particular sale being effected within the first quarter of this year. Keep it here at the People's Mirror as we keep you updated on what happens and what decisions are being made in government corners and in the Kenyan political scene. Until our next episode.